Hello, I'm Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. And today, I've got a little bit of a confession to make when it comes to recommendations that I make in the office. And this has everything to do with fasting and calorie restriction. I have always been a huge fan of calorie restriction without nutrient restriction. So I say your 1,200 calories a day comes from broccoli, not a Big Mac value meal. And it is very clear that cutting back on calories is good for us. However, keeping calories low is not always fair on people's list of desirable lifestyle approaches. So then comes the concept of, fasting, like not even just calorie restriction, but fasting is another powerful tool. I remember way back when there was a study on people with high blood pressure and they did water-only fasting and the results were amazing. They had a 60-point drop in their blood pressure. Like, there's no medication on the planet that can do that, let alone 8 days of a water-only fast. So it's a very powerful tool. So intermittent fasting, there's different flavors to that as well. And so I'll have patients that come in. I remember I had a patient, she was around my age. This was around 11 o'clock in the morning, and she was diabetic, and she said that she was doing intermittent fasting. I said, well, what does that look like to you? Because it's different for everybody. And she said, well, I just really don't have my first meal till about 1 or 2 o'clock. I'm like, what's in the Dunkin' Donuts cup? Turns out that she was having a 400 calorie pure carb drink for breakfast. She wasn't fasting. So it's something that we need to be clear on as far as what is fasting and what's not. So that enters the concept of time-restricted feeding. And this probably has the easiest applicability and some pretty good research behind it. And this is the idea of eating within a window, which helps regulate our circadian rhythms. It's more how we're designed. And there's different flavors, if you will. You can do an 18-8 or a 16-8 or an 18-6 or a 24. Couple things that I'm pretty confident on is a single meal a day, so that whole one meal, one meal a day, OMAD. I don't know that I'm generally a big fan. That's how we make sumo wrestlers, and I don't know that that's a viable option. Likely, just skipping breakfast to just skip breakfast and call it fasting is not a good option either. So here's where my confession comes in. I have always been a very staunch supporter of breakfast. So don't skip breakfast. And the data is very consistent with that people eat breakfast have a tendency to maintain their body weight. The only time I've ever considered that acceptable is what follows. I've always known as the Bahadori leanness principle. If you're doing some vigorous exercise, you can skip a meal. So I would do that typically like on Saturday mornings. I go train kickboxing, open mat and jiu-jitsu, and then judo, and not have a first meal till about noon or 12:30. But I was very active during that time frame. And so when we talk about time-restricted feeding and shrinking it down, early time-restricted feeding, so ETRF, where we eat breakfast and skip dinner, is unquestionably a better option. Here's my confession. It just doesn't fit into my lifestyle. If I go to a 6:30 jiu-jitsu class, I get home, it's 8 o'clock, 8:15, 8:30, finish dinner at 9, that's just not going to work. The option would be to do something to curb my hunger at night, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, and that's not necessarily a good option. So that's one of the things I grapple with. I've picked up about 4 or 5 extra pounds in this past few too many Mexican all-inclusive vacations, and I needed to be back down to my kickboxing weight from my early 20s. And so I decided to do time-restricted feeding, but that idea of eating breakfast and skipping dinner just wasn't going to fit in the lifestyle. So I chose to skip breakfast, eat my first meal around 1 o'clock, 1:30, and then have my dinner and try to not eat after that. What I used as a tool to control that because hunger, and I get grumpy when I get hungry, it can be an issue. So the key thing with fasting is you don't want to elicit an insulin response. And so things like fat will not elicit an insulin response. So if you have carbs or protein, so sometimes people will have their coffee, but they'll throw in a little bit of creamer or some coconut milk or something, and that just broke your fast. So you have to understand what we're talking about when we're having fasting. Anything that you do to break that is going to be unsuccessful in that route. So for me personally, I will do cold brew coffee. I try to do organic, but darn, that stuff's expensive. Chameleon's a certain good brand. So right now we just happen to have, this is one of the brands that we have handy. So I'll do a little bit of that, and I'll do heavy cream. Heavy cream's, we're not showing a good vision on here. In this, always buy organic. This is something they sell at Winco. If it happens to be at 11 o'clock at night and I've forgotten that we don't have any for the morning. So heavy cream, about 40 milliliters or so, which is probably about 120 calories, put into the cold brew. I will occasionally pour in a little bit of MCT oil. Again, hard to see that in the light. That's definitely no better. But some MCT oil, which does not break a fast as well and can help feed the energy. I don't have an energy problem, I have a hunger problem. And I found that using that, and again, we're not using that as a meal, we're using it to control your hunger until it comes time to eat. And I found that that's a very easy, acceptable way to control my hunger until it's time to eat. So I found that whole time-restricted feeding was a very easy plan to follow, and ended up taking off the 4 or 5 pounds that I wanted to. And now I usually do that a couple days a week, and I'll have my typical breakfast some other days. So I was a little surprised at how easy it was for me to follow that. And not a terribly big fan of dairy, not a big fan of skipping breakfast, but there is a time and a place for this. So time-restricted feeding can be a very powerful tool, but we have to do it in the right way. And as my patient who is drinking a 400-calorie mocha thought, that is not fasting. We need to do things that are not going to elicit an insulin response, and fat is a really good tool we can use to control our hunger, but not elicit an insulin response. So this was this video was triggered by an article talking about time-restricted feeding and circadian rhythms. I'll post a link to that particular study in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel. And please feel free to share any of your fasting stories that has worked for you in the comments section.